I never thought I'd be the kind of woman who'd outlive her husband. I always imagined Thomas would be the one standing at my graveside, probably wearing that old brown cardigan I tried to throw away a dozen times, telling our grandchildren stories about how stubborn I was. But life has a way of writing its own script, doesn't it? And now here I am, 73 years old, sitting in this empty house that still smells faintly of his aftershave, trying to make sense of a man I thought I knew better than anyone in this world. We met when I was 19, working at my father's flower shop on Maple Street. Thomas came in one Tuesday morning in April, his dark hair slicked back, wearing a suit that looked too big for his thin frame. He said he needed flowers for his mother's birthday, and I remember thinking how sweet it was that a young man would remember such a thing. He chose white roses, and when our fingers touched as I handed him the bouquet, something shifted in the air between us. It sounds like something from a cheap novel, I know, but that's exactly how it felt. Like the whole world had been slightly out of focus, and suddenly everything became clear. He came back the next week. No special occasion this time, he admitted with a shy smile. He just wanted to see me again. I was wearing my yellow dress, the one with the small flowers embroidered on the collar, and my mother had braided my hair that morning. I can still see the way he looked at me, like I was something precious and fragile, something worth protecting. We talked for an hour while I arranged carnations, about everything and nothing. He told me he worked at the factory on the edge of town, that he'd grown up in this very neighborhood, that he'd always wanted to travel but never seemed to find the right time. I told him about my dreams of becoming a teacher, about the books I loved, about how I used to climb the oak tree in our backyard, just to feel closer to the sky. We were married within a year. My father walked me down the aisle of St. Catherine's Church on a warm June morning, and when Thomas lifted my veil, I saw tears in his eyes. I remember thinking that I was the luckiest woman alive. He wasn't wealthy, he wasn't particularly ambitious, but he was kind. He was gentle. He made me laugh with his terrible jokes and held me when I cried. He was my best friend, and I believed that would be enough. I believed that love was enough. The first few years of our marriage were ordinary in the most beautiful way. We rented a small apartment above the bakery on 4th Street, where the smell of fresh bread would wake us every morning. Thomas would leave for work before dawn, and I'd pack his lunch in the same metal tin his father had used. We didn't have much money, but we had dreams. We'd lie in bed on Sunday mornings, making plans for the future. A house with a garden, children, maybe a dog. Thomas wanted 3 kids, I wanted 4. We'd compromise on 5, he'd joke, and I'd swat his arm playfully. I got pregnant 2 years into our marriage. I'll never forget the day I told him. I'd made his favorite dinner, meatloaf with mashed potatoes, and I'd placed the positive pregnancy test next to his plate, wrapped in tissue paper like a gift. He stared at it for a full minute without saying a word, and for a terrible moment, I thought he wasn't happy. Then he looked up at me with such pure joy on his face that I started crying. He pulled me into his arms and whispered into my hair, "We're going to be parents. We're actually going to be parents." We danced in that tiny kitchen, swaying to music only we could hear, and I felt so full of hope I thought my heart might burst. Our daughter Sarah was born on a snowy December evening. She had Thomas's dark hair and my green eyes, and she was perfect. Thomas was so nervous holding her at first, his hands trembling as he cradled her tiny body. "I'm afraid I'll break her," he whispered. But within days, he was a natural. He'd walk her around the apartment at 3 in the morning, singing old folk songs his grandmother had taught him. I'd watch them from the doorway, my heart overflowing with a love I didn't know was possible. 3 years later, we had Michael. Then 2 years after that, little Emma. Our apartment became too small, so Thomas took on extra shifts at the factory. He'd come home exhausted, his clothes smelling of grease and metal. But he'd still get down on the floor to play with the children. He'd build towers out of wooden blocks for them to knock down, read them stories in funny voices, tickle them until they squealed with laughter. He was a wonderful father. I want to make that clear because of what I'm about to tell you. Whatever else he was, whatever secrets he kept, he loved those children with every fiber of his being. We finally saved enough to buy a house when I was 32. It wasn't much, just a small two-story with peeling paint, and a yard full of weeds, but it was ours. Thomas spent every weekend fixing it up, painting walls, repairing the porch, planting roses in the garden, because he remembered they were my favorite. And there was a garage out back, an old detached structure that leaned slightly to one side. Thomas claimed it immediately as his workshop. "A man needs a space of his own," he said with a grin, and I laughed and told him he could have his cave as long as he kept the rest of the house presentable. That garage became his sanctuary. He'd disappear into it for hours after dinner, working on various projects. He fixed furniture, built bookshelves, repaired broken appliances from around the neighborhood. He always kept it locked, which I found a bit odd but chalked up to him being careful with his tools. "Don't want the kids getting hurt," he'd say, which made sense. The children knew not to bother Daddy in his workshop, and I respected his need for that private space. Everyone needs a room of their own, I thought. Some place where they can breathe. The years passed like pages in a book, some chapters more difficult than others. We had our struggles like any couple. Money was always tight. The factory went through rough periods, and there were times Thomas would come home with worry etched deep in the lines of his face. I went back to work when Emma started school, taking a job at the library, and every penny we made went toward keeping our heads above water. But we had each other. We had our children. We had Sunday dinners and Christmas mornings, and summer evenings sitting on the porch watching fireflies. We had a life, a real life, built on what I thought was a foundation of trust and honesty. There were little things over the years that didn't quite add up, tiny inconsistencies that I noticed but dismissed. Thomas would sometimes come home with extra money, not a lot, but enough that he'd surprise us with dinner at a restaurant or a new dress for one of the girls. Overtime, he'd explain, or fixed something for the boss. I believed him. Why wouldn't I? He'd occasionally take trips on weekends, saying the factory needed him to pick up parts from suppliers in neighboring towns. He'd be gone for 6 or 7 hours, come back tired but satisfied. "Long drive," he'd say, kissing my forehead. "But someone's got to do it." Once, maybe 20 years into our marriage, I found a photograph in his jacket pocket when I was doing laundry. It was old, creased, showing a small cottage by a lake. I asked him about it that evening, and he took it from my hands with a strange expression I couldn't quite read. "Just a place I saw once," he said. "Thought maybe someday we could visit." He put it in his wallet and never mentioned it again. I wanted to press him, but something in his eyes stopped me. There was a sadness there, deep and old, and I didn't want to hurt him by prying. So I let it go. I let so many things go. The children grew up, as children do. Sarah became a nurse, married a good man named David, gave us 2 beautiful grandchildren. Michael moved to California to work in computers, something I never quite understood but was proud of anyway. Emma stayed closest, teaching 3rd grade at the elementary school, just 10 minutes away. Thomas and I settled into the comfortable rhythm of growing old together. We'd sit on the porch in the evenings, holding hands, watching the neighborhood change around us. New families moved in, old friends moved away or passed on. The world kept turning and we turned with it. Thomas retired at 65, and for the first time in our marriage, he had real free time. I thought he might finally slow down, maybe take up fishing or join me for afternoon walks. Instead, he spent even more time in that garage, working on a special project. He'd say with a mysterious smile when I asked what kept him so occupied, "You'll see when it's finished." I teased him about it, calling him my mad scientist, but I didn't mind. He seemed happy, and that was what mattered. His health started declining when he turned 70. Small things at first. He'd lose his breath climbing the stairs. His hands would shake when he held his coffee cup. He brushed off my concerns, stubborn as always, but I finally convinced him to see a doctor. The diagnosis came on a Tuesday afternoon in October: congestive heart failure, treatable but not curable. The doctor gave him medications, told him to take it easy, said he probably had a few good years left if he was careful. Thomas took the news with a quiet dignity that broke my heart. That evening, he held me on our bed and whispered, "I'm not afraid of dying, Margaret. I'm only afraid of leaving you alone." He lasted 3 more years. 3 years of watching him slowly fade, like a photograph left too long in the sun. He kept working in his garage almost until the end, though his projects took longer, and he'd need to rest more frequently. I'd bring him tea and sandwiches, and we'd sit together among his tools and half-finished projects, talking about our life, our children, the grandchildren. He'd tell me I was still as beautiful as the day he'd walked into that flower shop, and I'd laugh and tell him he needed better glasses. But sometimes I'd catch him looking at me with such intensity, such desperate love, as if he was trying to memorize my face, as if he had something he wanted to tell me but couldn't find the words. The end came on a Sunday morning in spring. I woke up and knew immediately something was wrong. He was lying beside me, but his breathing was shallow, labored. I called the ambulance, rode with him to the hospital, held his hand while the doctors and nurses swarmed around him. Sarah and Emma arrived within an hour. Michael caught the first flight he could. We all gathered around his bed, this man who had been the center of our family, and watched him slip away. His last words were to me. He squeezed my hand with what little strength he had left and whispered, "The garage. Promise me you'll look in the garage. Third cabinet on the left, behind the paint cans. Promise me, Margaret." I promised, tears streaming down my face, not understanding but needing to give him that peace. He smiled, just barely, and then he was gone. The funeral was beautiful, if such a thing can be beautiful. The church was full of people whose lives Thomas had touched. Neighbors whose furniture he'd repaired, friends from the factory, people I didn't even know. They all had stories about his kindness, his generosity, his quiet strength. I sat in the front pew between my daughters, listening to these stories about my husband, and felt oddly disconnected, as if they were talking about a stranger. How could there be so much about him I didn't know? The days after the funeral blurred together. People brought casseroles and flowers. The house filled with sympathy cards. Everyone told me it would get easier with time, but the silence in the house was deafening. I'd wake up reaching for him, forgetting for just a moment that he was gone. I'd make too much coffee, set 2 places at the table. Grief is such a strange thing. It doesn't come all at once but in waves, catching you off guard at the oddest moments. It was 2 weeks after we buried him that I finally remembered his last words. The garage. I'd been avoiding it, couldn't bear to see his workspace empty of his presence. But I'd made a promise, and Thomas had never asked much of me. So one morning, after Sarah had gone back to her family and Emma had returned to work, I took the key from its hook by the kitchen door, and walked across the yard to that old, leaning garage. The door creaked when I opened it, and the smell hit me immediately, sawdust and oil and that particular scent that was uniquely Thomas. His tools hung neatly on the walls, organized in that precise way he had. His workbench was clean, as if he'd tidied up before the end, knowing someone else would eventually have to sort through his things. I stood there for a long moment, just breathing, trying not to cry. The third cabinet on the left was exactly where he'd said it would be. I moved aside the paint cans, my hands trembling slightly, and found a metal box pushed far back into the corner. It was locked, but the key was taped to the top. My heart was pounding as I opened it, though I couldn't have said why. What secrets could a man like Thomas have kept? What could be so important that his dying words were to make sure I found it? Inside were documents, letters, photographs, bank statements. I pulled everything out and spread it on the workbench, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the papers. And as I read, my entire world shifted on its axis, like the ground beneath my feet had suddenly turned to water. The first thing I found was a birth certificate, not ours, not our children's, a boy named Daniel, born 46 years ago, mother's name, Christine Morrison, father's name Thomas Edward Miller. My Thomas. My husband had a son I never knew existed. I had to sit down, my legs wouldn't hold me anymore. The garage spun around me, and for a moment I thought I might be sick. A son. Thomas had a son. The questions came so fast I couldn't process them. When? How? Why had he never told me? The letters explained everything, and nothing. They were from Christine, spanning decades. The first one was dated 2 years before Thomas and I met. She'd been his high school sweetheart, the daughter of another factory worker. They'd been young and in love and careless, and she'd gotten pregnant. Her family was deeply religious, and wouldn't hear of an abortion. Thomas had wanted to marry her, to do the right thing, but his father had forbidden it. His father, it turned out, had dreams of Thomas going to college, making something of himself, not getting trapped in factory work like he had been. His father had paid Christine's family to move away to another state. With money he'd saved for Thomas's education, the baby would be raised by Christine's aunt and uncle, and Thomas was to have no contact ever. But Christine had written to him anyway, sending letters to a post office box Thomas had kept secret all these years. In her letters, she told him about Daniel, about his first steps, his first words. She sent photographs. A chubby baby with Thomas's dark eyes, a toddler holding a toy truck, a boy missing his front teeth grinning at the camera, a teenager in a baseball uniform, a young man at his college graduation, a wedding photo with a beautiful blonde woman, photos of Daniel holding his own children, making Thomas a grandfather twice over through a family he'd never met. Christine's letters were kind, never accusatory. She understood, she wrote, that Thomas had been young and pressured by family. She'd married eventually, she said, a good man who'd adopted Daniel and raised him as his own. Daniel had a good life. He was happy. He didn't know Thomas existed, and Christine thought that was for the best. But she wanted Thomas to know his son, even if only through words and pictures. She wanted him to see what a wonderful man Daniel had become. Thomas had written back. I found his letters too, copies he'd kept. In them, he thanked her. He asked questions about Daniel's life. He sent money when he could, small amounts at first, larger sums as the years went on. Not child support, Christine had never asked for that. Just gifts, for birthdays and Christmases, always sent anonymously through Christine so Daniel would never know the truth. Thomas wrote about his own life too. About meeting me. About our wedding. About our children. About how every time he looked at Sarah or Michael or Emma, he thought of Daniel. About how he loved us all but carried the weight of this secret like a stone in his chest. The last letter from Christine was dated 6 months before Thomas died. Daniel was doing well, she wrote. He was a teacher, married with 2 kids of his own. He'd just bought a house, and his youngest daughter had started kindergarten. Christine's health was failing, she admitted. Cancer. She didn't have long left. She wanted Thomas to know that she'd never regretted having Daniel, not for a single moment. She thanked Thomas for being part of their lives, even from a distance. And she said something that made tears stream down my face. I've been thinking about Margaret. She must be a wonderful woman for you to have loved her so completely. Part of me envies her, getting to spend every day with you, while I only had letters and memories. But mostly I'm just grateful that you found happiness. You deserved that, Thomas. You always deserved that. There was one final document in the box. A letter addressed to me, in Thomas's handwriting, dated just a week before he died. My hands shook as I unfolded it. My dearest Margaret, it began. I don't know if I'll have the courage to tell you this while I'm alive. I've started this conversation in my head 1,000 times over the years, but the words never come out right. So I'm writing them down, hoping that if I can't say them to your face, at least you'll know the truth after I'm gone. Before I met you, I got a girl pregnant. Her name was Christine, and I loved her the way teenagers love, with all the passion and none of the wisdom that comes with age. When she told me she was pregnant, I wanted to marry her. I wanted to do the right thing. But my father had other plans for my life, and he made sure Christine and the baby disappeared from it. I was 18 and weak, and I let him. I let them take away my son, and I've regretted it every day since. When I met you in that flower shop, I was a broken young man trying to put together the pieces of a life I didn't recognize anymore. You made me whole again, Margaret. You made me believe I could be good. That I could build something beautiful out of the wreckage. But I couldn't tell you about Daniel. How do you tell the woman you want to marry that you already have a child you abandoned? How do you start a life together with a lie that big hanging between you? So I stayed silent, and the longer I stayed silent, the harder it became to speak. Every time I held Sarah as a baby, I thought of Daniel and wondered what he looked like at that age. Every time Michael learned to ride a bike or Emma lost a tooth, I wondered if Daniel had done the same things. Every birthday, every Christmas, every milestone with our children was beautiful and heartbreaking at once, because I was missing all of those moments with my first child. Christine wrote to me over the years. She was kinder than I deserved, keeping me informed about Daniel's life, even though I had no right to ask. I sent money when I could, small gifts from an anonymous source. It was the least I could do. It was all I could do. I want you to know that loving you was never a lie. You and our children were my whole world. You still are. Daniel was a shadow in my past, a wound that never quite healed, but you were my present and my future. You were my choice, my love, my everything. I just wish I'd been brave enough to tell you that you weren't my beginning. I'm sorry, Margaret. I'm sorry for lying to you all these years. I'm sorry for keeping this part of my life hidden. I'm sorry that you're finding out this way, after I'm gone and can't answer your questions or hold you while you process this. I'm sorry for all of it. There's money in the bank accounts listed in this box. More than we ever needed, saved over the years from overtime and careful investments. I want you to have it, to do with as you wish. But I also hope you might consider reaching out to Daniel. His address is enclosed. He doesn't know about me, and Christine passed away 3 months ago, so you'd have to tell him everything. I have no right to ask this of you, but I can't die without hoping that someday, somehow, he might know he had a father who thought about him every single day, even if I was too much of a coward to ever meet him. Whatever you decide, know that I loved you with everything I had. You were the best thing that ever happened to me. You made me a better man than I would have been otherwise. And if I could go back and do it all again, I'd still choose you. I'd just be brave enough to tell you the truth from the start. Forever yours, even now, even after, Thomas. I sat in that garage for hours, maybe days. Time stopped having meaning. I read the letters over and over, looked at the photographs of Daniel at different ages, trying to see Thomas in his features. The same dark eyes, the same crooked smile, the same way he tilted his head slightly when he looked at the camera. My husband's son. My children's half-brother, a whole person who existed in the world, living his life. With no idea that his biological father had just died, had been thinking about him for 46 years, had loved him from a distance through photographs and letters. The anger came in waves. How dare he keep this from me? How dare he let me believe I knew him when there was this massive piece of his life I knew nothing about? All those times I'd worried about money, worked extra hours at the library, stressed about college tuition for our kids, and he'd had money saved. All those times he'd seemed distant or sad, and I'd thought it was work stress or worry about bills, when really he was grieving a son he'd never held. But underneath the anger was something more complicated. Sadness for Thomas, who'd carried this burden alone for his entire adult life. Sadness for Christine, who'd raised a child as a single mother and kept Thomas's secret even after she remarried. Sadness for Daniel, who'd grown up not knowing his real father. And sadness for myself. For all the conversations Thomas and I never had, for all the years we spent together with this wall of silence between us. I thought about all those weekends Thomas had spent in this garage. I'd thought he was working on projects, building furniture, fixing broken things. But now I wondered how much of that time was spent with these letters, these photographs, this secret life. How many hours had he sat on this very stool, looking at pictures of a son he'd never met, while I was in the house cooking dinner, or helping the kids with homework? How often had he been right here? Close enough that I could have walked across the yard and joined him, but separated from me by a lie he couldn't seem to confess. I found myself thinking about Christine too. What kind of woman writes to her ex-boyfriend for decades, keeping him updated on the child he'd abandoned? A generous one, a forgiving one. Maybe one who'd never quite stopped loving him, even after she'd married someone else and built a different life. Her letters were full of warmth and understanding, never blame or bitterness. She could have demanded more money, could have told Daniel the truth and forced Thomas into a relationship he wasn't prepared for. Instead, she'd given him the gift of child from a safe distance, asking nothing in return. The hardest part was thinking about Daniel. Did he know he was adopted? Had Christine's husband legally adopted him, or had they just raised him as their own? Had Daniel ever wondered about his biological father? And now, with both Thomas and Christine gone, was I supposed to reach out to this complete stranger, and turn his whole world upside down? I took the boxed letters and documents back to the house. I hid it in my closet, not ready for anyone else to know. Not ready to tell Sarah and Michael and Emma that their father had kept this secret, that they had a half-brother they'd never met. Not ready to make any decisions at all, but I kept thinking about Thomas's last request. He wanted me to contact Daniel. After 46 years of silence, after a lifetime of being too afraid to reach out himself, he wanted me to do it for him. The audacity of it made me angry all over again. Even in death, he was asking me to clean up his mess, to be brave in ways he never could be. Still, I couldn't stop looking at Daniel's photographs. In the most recent ones, he looked so much like Thomas it made my chest ache. Same build, same way of standing with his hands in his pockets, same lines around his eyes when he smiled. And his children, Thomas's grandchildren, had that same dark hair that all our kids had inherited. They were family, these people I'd never met, connected to me through a man who'd kept us apart. It took me 3 months to make a decision. 3 months of sleepless nights and tear-stained mornings. 3 months of looking at my own children and wondering how they'd feel when they learned the truth. 3 months of carrying Thomas's secret the way he'd carried it, and finally understanding how heavy it was, how it could shape every day and every choice. In the end, it was something Emma said that decided me. She'd stopped by one afternoon, found me crying at the kitchen table with one of Daniel's photos in my hand. I'd quickly put it away, but she'd seen enough to ask questions. So I told her everything. And when I finished, when I'd explained the whole complicated, painful truth, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Mom, Dad made a lot of mistakes. But he loved us, and if he loved us that much, he must have loved Daniel too, even though he never got to show it. Don't you think Daniel deserves to know that his father thought about him? That he wasn't just abandoned and forgotten?" So I wrote a letter. I drafted it 12 times, trying to find the right words to tell a stranger that his entire understanding of his origins was built on half-truths. I explained who I was, who Thomas had been. I told him about Christine's letters, about how Thomas had followed his life from afar, about how he'd wanted to reach out but never found the courage. I included copies of some of the letters, some of the photographs Thomas had kept. And I gave him my address and phone number, telling him he could contact me if he wanted, or not, that the choice was entirely his and I respect whatever he decided. I mailed the letter on a Tuesday in September, exactly 6 months after Thomas died, and then I waited. The call came 3 weeks later, a man's voice, tentative and thick with emotion as Miller. "This is Daniel Morrison. I got your letter." We talked for 2 hours that first time. He'd known he was adopted, it turned out. Christine and her husband had always been honest about that, though they'd never told him details about his biological parents. Finding out his father had been Thomas, that he'd been alive all these years, just a few states away, was overwhelming. He was angry, he admitted, angry at Thomas for not reaching out, angry at Christine for keeping the secret, angry at the grandfather he'd never known, who'd paid to make the problem go away. But he was also curious. He wanted to know about Thomas, about me, about his half-siblings. We met in person a month later. Daniel drove down with his wife Kelly and their 2 children. I'd told Sarah, Michael, and Emma by then, and they'd all agreed to be there, even though it was awkward and strange, and no one quite knew how to act. When Daniel walked through my door, I gasped. It was like seeing a ghost, like Thomas had somehow come back. He had the same walk, the same gestures. When he smiled, my heart broke and healed at the same time. This was Thomas's son, Thomas's firstborn, the child he'd grieved for in silence for almost 50 years. We sat in the living room, this group of people connected by blood and secrets, and slowly, carefully, we started building something new. Daniel told us about his life, his childhood, his career as a history teacher. Sarah, Michael, and Emma told him about growing up with Thomas, about the father he'd never known. We looked through photograph albums together, Daniel pointing out similarities between himself and his half-siblings, marveling at how much his daughter looked like Emma. It wasn't easy. There were tears and difficult questions and moments of painful silence. Daniel struggled with the knowledge that Thomas had raised 3 children while keeping him at a distance. My kids struggled with learning their father had kept such an enormous secret. I struggled with all of it. With anger at Thomas mixed with grief mixed with this strange new complicated love for this man who was both a stranger and family. But slowly over months and years, we became something like a family. Daniel and his siblings forged their own relationship, built on the shared connection of a father they'd known in different ways. His children called me grandma, and I sent them birthday cards and Christmas presents like I did for all my grandchildren. We had dinners together, awkward at first, then more comfortable. We shared stories about Thomas, piecing together a more complete picture of who he'd been. And through it all, I found myself understanding Thomas better. Not forgiving him, exactly. I don't know if I'll ever fully forgive the lies, the secrets, the ways he let me believe I knew him when I didn't. But understanding him. Understanding that people are complicated, that they make mistakes when they're young and then spend the rest of their lives trying to figure out how to fix them. Understanding that sometimes luck enough to make you brave, that fear and shame can keep you silent even when silence causes more harm than truth ever could. I'm 75 now, 2 years past Thomas's death. I still live in our house, and I still sometimes sit in that old garage, surrounded by his tools and his memory. But now I have something Thomas never had. I have Daniel in my life. I have all of Thomas's children together, building relationships, creating new memories. I have Thomas's grandchildren, all of them, knowing each other, playing together, connected by blood even though they grew up apart. Sometimes I'm still angry at Thomas. Sometimes I cry because he put me in this impossible position, made me the keeper of his secrets, forced me to build bridges he should have built himself. But sometimes I look at Daniel and his siblings laughing together over dinner, and I think maybe Thomas knew what he was doing. Maybe he knew I was stronger than he was, braver than he was. Maybe he knew I'd do what he couldn't. Or maybe he was just a flawed man who made mistakes, and hoped desperately that love would be enough to redeem them. I've learned that you can love someone completely, and still not know them fully. I've learned that secrets have a weight that doesn't disappear when the secret keeper dies, that lies leave shadows that outlast the liar. I've learned that family is more complicated than blood, that forgiveness is a choice you make every day, and that sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is the truth, even when it comes too late. Thomas kept a secret his whole life, and after he passed away, I opened his old garage and found not just one revelation but a whole hidden history. It changed how I remembered him, yes. But it also gave me something unexpected. It gave me Daniel. It gave my children a brother. It gave me a bigger, messier, more complicated family than I ever imagined having. Was it worth it? Would I rather have had the truth from the beginning? I don't know. I'll never know. All I have is this life, this strange aftermath of secrets revealed, and the choice of what to do with it. I choose to build something from the wreckage. I choose to love all of Thomas's children, including the one he couldn't acknowledge. I choose to tell Daniel stories about his father, to show him the good alongside the complicated. I choose to be the bridge Thomas was too afraid to build himself. And when I'm gone, when my children and Daniel gather for my funeral, they'll stand together as family. Imperfect, stitched together by secrets and revelations, but family nonetheless. That's my gift to Thomas, I suppose. The family he always wanted but was too afraid to claim. The garage is emptier now. I donated most of Thomas's tools, kept only a few pieces that seemed important. But I kept all the letters, all the photographs. They're part of our history now, part of the story I'll leave behind. The full story, with all its shadows and complications. Because that's what love is, isn't it? Not the fairy tale where everything is perfect, but the messy, complicated truth where people fail and hurt each other and still, somehow, find their way to grace. Where secrets kept in garages eventually come to light, and families broken by fear and shame slowly knit themselves back together. Thomas is gone, but his legacy lives on in ways he never expected. In Daniel's laugh that sounds like his. In the grandchildren who play together, connected by blood they didn't know they shared. In the family dinners where Thomas's name is spoken with love and frustration, and forgiveness all mixed together. I still wear his cardigan sometimes, when the evenings get cold. I still tend the roses he planted in our garden. I still love him, despite everything, because of everything. And I hope, wherever he is, He knows that his secret is finally free, and so are we all. That's what I found in Thomas's garage. Not just his hidden past, but a path to a future he couldn't imagine. A family made whole by truth, even when the truth came too late. That's his real legacy. Not the lies but what we built from their ruins, and somehow, impossibly, that feels like enough.